It's Tim from Groove FM. I'm calling for an interview.
Tim, how are you?
Yeah, great, thanks. Hey, I'll just get some levels from you because we're going to do this as a radio one. I'm using my trusty iPad to record it. So modern technology.
Very, very modern.
Yeah.
Yeah, terrific. I'm using headphones at the moment, so hopefully that's coming through okay.
Yeah, sweet. That sounds pretty good. Okay, so a quick introduction here. I'm talking to Sebastian Hampson, and he is the writer of a wonderful new book called The Benefactor. This is your second book, isn't it? And wonderfully on the Australian imprint, which is called Text, which is a big coup, isn't it? Your first one was called The Train to Paris. That's right?
Yes, that's right.
Yes.
Yeah, it was a few years ago now, and since then I've been working on The Benefactor, and really excited to be releasing it now. It's quite a different thing from my first novel, so it's been very interesting to see how people have responded to it.
Yes, the first book I remember talking to you a while ago, and The Train to Paris, you said at the time that you'd never actually been to that part of the world, but you wrote it using Google and various other aspects and things like that.
Sorry, I don't think I did say that.
You've caught me out.
I did live in Paris.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. But no, I did live in Paris for a little over 6 months, and travelled around while I was there. So I did, possibly what I was alluding to, I can't remember this long ago now, but it was possibly that I'd been using Google and whatnot to research the areas that I'd already visited in more detail, essentially how I work. But for The Benefactor, this was something that I wrote during about 18 months living in the States.
Right.
So in New York mostly, and it's set entirely in New York and focuses exclusively on American characters, most of whom don't bear any similarity to myself, which is quite an interesting position to be in.
Yeah, I wanted to.
So
yeah.
It's also set in multiple different historical periods, recent historical periods, if you like. So some are set in the 80s, some are set in the 90s, and it all required a lot of intensive research.
Yeah, I wanted to ask for the. I think growing up in American 80s and then growing up with American 90s and now the 2000 and Trump years, I guess. What differences did you find? I mean, the 80s in America, we were dominated with the Reagan years and the kind of threat of nuclear war and things like that. Was that something that came across, that kind of politics, that kind of spectre seems to have been there at the time, and also the period of excess and the mobile phone and all those sorts of extremities?
Yeah. Well, definitely that culture of excess informs the novel because our main character is a glamorous magazine editor, and so he's very much in the thick of that strange, seedy, excessive world. But it was interesting looking at the 80s in particular, and thinking about how obviously there have been a lot of cultural shifts in the time between then and now, but there is still a remarkable amount of if you like, resonance of those times and those kind of cultural values in what we're looking at these days in America. I think, I certainly in New York, my impression was that some sense of excess has returned, and it's going to be quite an interesting time in American history right now. it's all a bit of a mess, but at the same time there seems to be a lot of regression in terms of cultural values and mores and that sort of thing.
Yeah, definitely. I couldn't help thinking with the 80s period, the novel that struck me as being sort of not a parallel, but definitely it painted the picture in my head when I was reading this was the book American Psycho, about simply the way they dress, the narcissism, the behaviours, the placing of a mobile phone, for example, on a table like a sword, that kind of stockbroker kind of thing was behind the scenes. You're right, it has kind of returned in that sense, particularly the difference between rich and poor. That's come out, hasn't it?
Sure.
Yeah. Was that what appealed to you?
In some ways, yeah. And I spent quite a bit of time when I was living there mixing with the more excessive end of the kind of Upper East Side social scene, and meeting some people who I found to be, genuinely hollow and superficial. But I kept thinking, the better I got to know them, I thought these people must have some humanity and some depth behind them. And so that pursuit of humanity behind the superficiality was a large part of what inspired, especially the character of Henry. He's somebody who is in many ways a victim of society's expectations of him. He's not a genuinely bad person, but because he operates in a world that expects him to behave in a certain way, he does adopt values and attitudes that are not true to who he is. So the novel is a process of uncovering that true identity, I think.
That's fascinating. How did you end up being in this particular universe, I suppose? What brought you to that place?
Bizarrely enough, it was through the fine wine trade, which is something I've been very involved in since I lived in France, and I just threw myself right into it when I was living in New York, and so I got to meet these people. A lot of them were clients, and a lot of them were insane people. Potentially not confirmed, but very, very likely to be drug lords and ex-mafia types, and very, very, very interesting, colourful group of people that you meet in that sort of high-end wine trade part of the world. So that was where a lot of those connections came from, and it's been quite strange coming back from that to the real world, if you like, of New Zealand.
Yeah. Well, you found yourself in Auckland, which must be quite a letdown compared to there.
Yes. Well, I do really love Auckland. It's a nice place to live, but yeah, it is quite a shock to the system always coming back from somewhere like New York.
Yes, well, we always had a challenge. I know that you studied at Victoria University, so are you Wellingtonian at heart? Is that your centre of the universe that pulls you out? Is that how that works?
Could be, yeah. I think I'm always leaving Wellington to go off and explore other things and have different adventures. But I do have a soft spot in my heart for Wellington, and the fact that there is just that there is a palpable sense of culture and appreciation of culture down in Wellington. It's a very special thing, and I've even had people who've visited from overseas comment on that, how culturally aware and sensitive to it people in Wellington are. And on that vein, I'm so grateful to Unity Books, both down in Wellington and up in Auckland, for the amount of support they've shown in my work, because it's very clear to me that they have their hearts behind supporting local authors, which is it's a huge thing. something we're very lucky to have.
Yeah, certainly. Well, definitely Wellington throws itself into its book culture as much as possible. One of the things, and speaking of which, one of the things before we get onto the book itself, I just wanted to check, you're aware that the New Zealand Festival is coming up next year. Are you going to be involved in that like you were last time?
At this stage I'm not. No, I can't get that into my schedule now because I'm pretty well booked out up here in Auckland, but I would love to. Hopefully next time it comes around we'll be able to have some involvement in it again.
Oh, well, we hope so. We'd love to see you back down here, where you belong.
Indeed, yeah.
Now, let's very briefly, I just want to go through the plot of this wonderful book. It's the centre character is one of the centre characters is a magazine editor, Henry Calder. He's lost his wife less than a year ago, and he's been ousted from the glamorous job that he did have. And then he runs into this interesting young artist called Maggie, who works as a bartender, and then after being evicted, he kind of becomes he sort of reaches out to her, and she ends up in his life. And then her art starts to disturb him. This is a kind of a cynical view of the good Samaritan to some degree, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. And it is a very dark interpretation of it. There's actually that aspect of the plot was inspired by a film producer in New York who garnered a bit of a reputation for picking young talent, but also acting as the kind of good Samaritan character towards them. He would.
So not Harvey Weinstein then.
Not Harvey Weinstein. No. No. That would not quite on that end of the spectrum. Still pretty questionable. And he would, from what I read, he would do things like, if they didn't have medical insurance, he would bail them out, and things like that.
Yeah.
Who knows what else was going on? And I thought this was an interesting dynamic to look at. The idea of bringing a young artist into the life of somebody whose values and experience is so different, almost directly opposed to her own. And it's complicated even further by the fact that he recognises uncannily aspects of his wife and this young woman, and there's a very intense kind of interplay between fantasy and false memory and all these things. It creates a very very psychologically messy situation for both of them.
So we get, we obviously get the typical model of altruism, which is that you see something of yourself or your life in somebody else, and you want to either keep that alive or restore it, or pay it back or pay it forward, or something along those lines. And then we get this aspect of art, which is, it's kind of the soothsaying approach, isn't it? That there's this magic that comes with it, and that's what you're exploring to some degree, isn't it? About predicting the future, or changing the future, or changing the nature of the way you look at things. So where did all this come from? You spent a lot of time in the Museum of Modern Art in New York while you were there.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, it came from a lot of the same ideas that that are behind what you described as then art's transformative power, if you like. That was all stuff that I had written on in my thesis when I was studying art history. So in some ways, my thesis became a prototype for the novel. Not that it's a very intellectual novel, but it is. Those ideas were definitely on my mind when I was writing it. And I think very deeply about art and how it as you say, it fundamentally alter your perception of your own reality, or even make you question aspects of your life that you wouldn't have touched otherwise. And so it was quite interesting to me to put that idea in the hands of, or in the head of, a character who is quite unfulfilled in his life, and is writing a memoir, trying to make sense of his life, but finding that many things are missing.
Yeah, I couldn't help, with the art aspect in particular, I was drawn back to a film you may have seen a few years ago. Donald Sutherland and Will Smith, I think, is in it. I think it's called 6 Degrees of Separation, and it's set in the high-end world of the apartment world of New York, and so a young poor guy is basically cons his way into the art world, with Donald Sutherland being a very rich man, and there's a lot of this interplay between what art means and why it's important, but also why it belongs to the rich and the pretentious, and so what is a con? Is art a con? There's a lot of interplay with that, and I couldn't help thinking that sort of theme is something that's running through this as well, to some degree. I see parallels there.
Yeah, that's great to know. I have to admit I haven't seen that movie, but I've heard of it. Yeah, I mean, there were several similar ideas that inspired this one. I mean, actually, there's a book that Michael Cunningham wrote called it's By Nightfall, which is one of his lesser known books, but he explores the idea of both art and beauty specifically, impacting on a gallery dealers in New York's kind of relationships and his self-perception. So yeah, there are definitely precedents to this kind of thing, but the most important thing for me is that the novel is fundamentally an examination of memory and how we construct our identity through memory.
Yeah.
And not just our own memories, but also the perspectives of others, the people closest to us in our lives. And Henry is surrounded by women, and it's quite interesting because I made a stylistic decision to not just stick with Henry's perspective in the novel, but to bring in the voices of the women in his life, because they are extremely illuminating about who he is as a person, and how deluded some of his own ideas of himself are.
Yeah, that's sort of, in a way, it's like changing the channel, but seeing the same show from a different camera angle to a degree.
Exactly, yeah,
which is kind of interesting, because I think the female gaze on males is always it's always multifaceted, whereas the male one always, in most characters, the male either seems to be completely obsessed by something or completely unaware of what's going on around them. There doesn't seem to be any sort of grey area, unless they're in philosophy land when it comes to most novels like that. They're either doing something or thinking about it, but not actually, they can't do both at the same time. It seems to be a common aspect, whereas the females get to be more shades of grey and more challenging themselves and that sort of thing, particularly in modern novels. At least that's what I've experienced.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? And I think there is a lot of truth in that too. I mean, and that's one thing I really wanted to do with this novel, rather than having it be exclusively the Henry show, which it could have been very easily.
Yeah.
To have to allow for other voices to come in, and more or less comment on when he is bullshitting himself, if you like.
Yeah, which he does quite a bit, doesn't he?
Yeah, well, he does, yeah. But it is, I think, I mean, I won't reveal what happens in the course of the novel, of course, but fiction is certainly, flirted with, and that's why I make such a point about the humanity and the depth behind the superficiality in Henry.
Yeah, definitely. So I was just reading the back of this, and I noticed that you've done a few acknowledgements, and of course one of them is to your friends in New York. So have they read it? What do they think of it?
They haven't had a chance to read it yet, because
Right.
I haven't bloody got around to sending them copies. But I will be doing that, because I want to know what they think of it. It'll be quite interesting, I think. I mean, everyone who knows me, and anyone who knows a writer, will look at work and see aspects of themselves in it, because that's just how we read things. But I think there were so many colourful characters that I encountered when I was there that they all distilled into a kind of big pot of inspiration, if you like, and I'll be interested to see how much of it kind of rings true for them.
Yeah, of the characters, was Michael Gifkins one of those?
He was not. No.
So you've dedicated the manuscript to him. So what was his part in this?
Yeah. So Michael was my agent, and a very, I mean, that's a very special role to have, especially when you're quite new to the business of publishing. And he very, very sadly passed not long after my first novel was released.
Right.
Quite suddenly, and this actually, a very early version of the Benefactor was one of the last things that he read, and he did tell me that it was that he enjoyed it, and that it was something that he wanted to see published. So in many ways, I went through the editorial process and finished it for him as a tribute to him. So yeah, there's quite a big aspect in there.
Well, we're glad he did. It's interesting. I think actually when I think of agents, I never think of an agent when I read a book, except of course when they send them to me. But that's the part of the publicity stuff. But now I think about it in terms of New York, and in terms of the whole book trade, and in terms of the like you said, the levels of superficiality and all that sort of product stuff that was going on. Was that something that was in your head as well, with all these interesting characters? Were you thinking of those sorts of things?
In terms of publishing as well?
Well, maybe the publishing world, the music world, the art world.
My own experience with publishing has been, extremely, privileged and good, because I'm lucky enough to be with one of the best publishers in Australia, and so I haven't actually encountered the superficial end of the publishing world at all, really. I've been lucky enough to work with people who are genuinely supportive of me, and have my artistic development more at the forefront of their minds than commercial interests. So my own experience there has been nothing but positivity. But it's true that in New York, it's very different there, and of course, Henry being a magazine editor, I did go into quite a lot of research about that that world, specifically the magazine publishing world, which interestingly is not so much about words, especially these days. It's all about images, and that's something that Henry makes a point of. Even he is all about the image. He doesn't, and the words on the page should just be there to support these beautiful, glamorous images. And I think that's a mentality that our society is moving towards content now.
Which is interesting in terms of the, I guess, the superficiality again, and the glamorousness of everything. Everything's clickbait, and everything's paints the picture for you, so you don't have to do it yourself anymore, and puts everything into a nice categorical box. But magazines have always done that, and I think of Vogue, and I think of Tatler's and Harper's Bazaar, and fashion magazines in particular, and then literary magazines. And every genre has a way of, I guess, preparing yourself for what you're about to experience. Even hunting and fishing shows you what you should wear and where you should go and things like that. It helps categorize you. So was that something that you experienced, and this is something that Henry has a problem with?
Well, I wouldn't say that Henry necessarily has a problem with it, not immediately anyway, because he doesn't want to sit back and think about it.
Yeah.
He's very happy with his position as a sort of auteur, somebody who curates beautiful images and distills general cultural trends and ideas into single images. I think he takes a lot of pride in that, especially, when he has the job, he takes a lot of pride in that. But I think his journey is about realizing that there may be more going on in images than just a projection of his fantasies and of society's kind of categorizations and expectations.
So that's partly what comes into the novel here. So thank you very much for explaining that. It's a wonderful read, and I think it's one I actually had to read it some parts of it a couple of times, because I went into it with certain eyes, and then I realised I needed to almost stop and cut that out, because the trouble with reading a lot is that you know too much, and sometimes you need to kind of clear your brain of things. And I really enjoyed the second half of the book because of that, where I found myself going into territory I was not really familiar with, which I really enjoyed. I can see the research you've done on this. One last question. What was the most difficult thing to research in this book?
The most difficult? That's a great question. To me, it was probably it was actually Henry's wife's job would have been the hardest thing, because that is a world that I have absolutely no familiarity with. She's a humanitarian who spends most of her life working for UNICEF, and I really had to go into a lot of depth there, because at least in the magazine world and those sorts of areas, I had some connections. I had people I could talk to about what it's really like, but I don't really know anybody in the humanitarian world. So I had to do a lot of reading and a lot of backgrounding on what that's like as a day-to-day job, especially going into that from the perspective of from a woman's perspective as well. Very, very tricky thing to do, but I think I wanted it to be as convincing as it could be, so I did the extra hard yards to try and make it as real as it could possibly be.
Well, it certainly painted it for me. I'm not an expert on that either, but I read it as if it was there. I didn't really think, hold on, that's not right. I guess you sort of, I've heard writing described as three things. It's either write what you know, write what you'd like to know, or write whatever you feel. And yours is, what you know, because you have to know it. So you have to find out about it, which is, it's definitely painting something that does exist. So you take the writer to a place. This is what I found out, and this is what I now know. So that's your approach. Is that right?
Yes, I would say so. I think of it like it is performance, basically. You are, as an author, claiming to be an authority on every subject that you touch, and so you have to do your homework.
There's certainly a bit of pressure on you there. You probably have to Google everything to make sure it's right, and then check again.
Oh, yeah, man. Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, I use things like archives of New York Times articles, and you know, as much content as I can get through my subscription anyway. But yeah, and then there's first-hand experience. It's talking to people who lived in New York in the 80s and the 90s, and trying to get a handle on what it was like, how those cultural shifts have changed people. I mean, there's all sorts of work that has to be done into it.
It certainly will be interesting looking at this book in maybe 20 years' time and looking back to see, you know, how much our own memories of things and our own perceptions of things have yet changed again, and how much of that's cyclic and how much of it will be, you know, a point in time, I guess. Yeah, and that's always something that you get from writing about a specific time period, and it is interesting because you don't know, except with hindsight, if you've captured the current world that you're surrounded by accurately or not. So yeah, it will be interesting to see. Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much for talking to me on this. Sebastian Hampson has a book out called The Benefactor. It's the second book on text publishing. What's next for you after producing this and obviously putting it on the road, doing the book tours, all that kind of thing?
Yeah. Well, I need to take a bit of a breather, to be honest, because I've been working on this one intensely for the last 3 or 4 years, and it's actually taken quite a lot out of me. So I need to take a little break and think about where to from here. But it'll be somewhere very different. We know that.
Well, look forward to that journey wherever it takes us. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Tim.
Okay. Bye-bye.